In the dead of winter, deep in the frozen mountains of Wyoming, a man lived alone in a small wooden cabin, forgotten by the world, and trying to forget it in return. But one stormy night, a faint knock at his door changed everything. A dying mother grizzly, two freezing cubs, and a choice no one else would dare to make. He opened the door. That moment ignited a chain of breathtaking events, where survival, compassion, and an impossible trust between man and beast collided in ways no one could have imagined. The wind screamed across the mountains that night, a sound that could make even the bravest man feel small. Snow hurled itself against the wooden walls of Caleb Warren's cabin, burying the world in a white, endless roar. Inside, the fire crackled weakly in the hearth, fighting a battle it was destined to lose. Caleb sat in silence, staring into the flames as if they might answer him. 3 years had passed since the storm that took his daughter. Since then, the wilderness had become his penance, his way to live without really living. The storm outside was the kind that erased everything: the trail, the sky, even the line between courage and foolishness. Caleb had weathered many nights like this, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the wind's pitch, higher than usual, or maybe it was that deep, uneasy stillness between gusts. Whatever it was, it crawled under his skin like a warning. Then came the sound. A soft scrape at first, so faint he thought it might be the wind shifting the snow against the door. But then another sound followed. A thud. Heavy. Desperate. Caleb's breath caught. Out here, miles from the nearest road, nothing human knocked on your door. He reached instinctively for the rifle leaning against the wall, his hand steady, though his heart began to hammer in his chest. The knocking came again, weaker this time. 3 slow, dragging thumps. Caleb rose, the firelight stretching his shadow across the cabin walls. He moved to the door, boots creaking on the wooden floorboards. The storm outside howled, shaking the frame. He hesitated. In these woods, opening the wrong door could be the last mistake a man ever made. He unlatched it anyway. The door cracked open, and the wind exploded into the cabin, biting his face with ice and snow. Through the blizzard's chaos, he saw movement. A dark, hulking shape collapsed near the porch. His eyes struggled to focus through the swirling white. Then he saw them. A massive grizzly bear lay sprawled in the snow, her chest heaving in shallow breaths. 2 small cubs clung to her side, their tiny bodies trembling uncontrollably. One of them whimpered, a sound so frail it barely reached his ears over the storm. Caleb froze. Every instinct screamed for him to shut the door, to let nature take its course. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the bear's head twitched toward the light, or the pitiful squeal of the smaller cub trying to move. The mother wasn't attacking, she was barely alive. He stepped out into the storm, snow lashing at his coat, his boots sinking deep with every step. The cubs didn't run. They couldn't. Up close he could see frost clinging to their fur, their eyes half closed. One of them had blood frozen around its leg, caught and torn. The smell of iron and pain hung in the air. "God help me," Caleb muttered, kneeling down. The mother bear lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. There was no aggression there, no fury, just exhaustion, and something else. A plea. The cold cut through his gloves as he reached toward the wounded cub. The bear's nostrils flared, her muscles tensing for a brief, instinctive second, but she didn't move. Caleb's hands shook as he freed the cub's leg from a tangle of frozen wire still attached to a crude steel trap. The trap looked old, rusted, illegal. Someone had left it out here long after hunting season. Caleb cursed under his breath. He had seen traps like this before, during his years as a rescue ranger. They weren't meant to catch and release. They were meant to maim and drag out death slowly. Whoever said it hadn't cared what suffered. He looked at the cub again. It was barely breathing now. The mother bear tried to lift herself, but her body gave out, collapsing back into the snow with a low moan that carried through the wind. Caleb's chest tightened. "Easy, girl," he whispered, unsure if the words were for her or for himself. "You're not here to hurt me, are you?" He glanced back at the open door of his cabin, the warm glow spilling into the night. The thought of what he was about to do went against every rule of survival he'd ever learned. Yet leaving them out here would mean watching them die, and Caleb had watched enough life fade away in his time. He dropped his rifle onto the porch and stepped closer. His breath came out in white clouds as he gripped the cub gently, lifting its frail body. The mother's head followed the motion, eyes dark and full of fear. But still, no sound, no growl, no fight. Just trust. Or maybe surrender. Caleb carried the cub into the cabin, laying it on an old wool blanket near the fire. He turned back into the storm and met the bear's gaze once more. Her fur was crusted with ice, her paws raw from the frozen ground. "Come on," he murmured. "You can't stay out here." She didn't move at first, just stared, snow swirling between them. Then, slowly, painfully, she dragged herself forward. Each step looked like it might be her last. Caleb backed away, holding the door open wider. When her massive body crossed the threshold, the cabin seemed to shrink. She filled the space with the scent of the wild, earth, pine, and something ancient. The second cub stumbled after her, collapsing beside its sibling. Caleb shut the door against the storm, sealing them all in one impossible moment of silence. The fire hissed as wet fur dripped onto the wooden floor. For several long seconds, no one moved. The bear stood trembling, her breath rasping in the warm air. Her eyes darted between her cubs and Caleb, who stood motionless, his hand still on the door handle. If she wanted to kill him, she would have already done it. Instead, she lowered herself onto the floor with a heavy sigh, her head drooping beside her cubs. Caleb slowly backed toward the fireplace, his pulse thundering in his ears. He watched as the smaller cub shivered beneath the blanket. Without thinking, he grabbed another from the couch and tossed it gently toward them. The bear didn't react. The cubs did. They burrowed into the fabric, small bodies curling together. The mother exhaled, a deep, rumbling sound of relief that vibrated through the floorboards. Caleb sank into the chair by the fire, every muscle taut. He couldn't believe what he'd just done. A wild grizzly and her cubs were lying on his cabin floor, the storm still raging outside. His eyes fell to the metal trap resting near the door, the one he'd torn from the cub's leg. Its jagged teeth gleamed dully in the firelight. The storm had brought them here, but someone else had started this. Somewhere out there, a man had set this pain in motion. Caleb stared into the fire, feeling the weight of the decision he'd made. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if that made him safer, or in far greater danger. Outside, the wind screamed again, but inside the cabin, only the soft crackle of the fire and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the bear family filled the air. Caleb closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to steady the tremor in his heart. He had let them in. Whatever happened next would change everything. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He sat in the same wooden chair near the fire, eyes fixed on the massive creature lying on his cabin floor. The bear hadn't moved much since collapsing. Her breathing was deep and steady now, the kind of breath that told him she was still alive, but not yet safe. The cubs were nestled in the blankets he had laid out, their small bodies rising and falling with a fragile rhythm. Every now and then, one would stir, letting out a faint, tired whimper before curling tighter against its sibling. The fire had burned low, the last logs glowing with soft amber light. Caleb rose to feed it quietly, careful not to make sudden movements. The sound of the wood catching flame echoed louder than he expected in the hushed room. The mother bear's ears twitched. She didn't lift her head, but her eyes opened just enough to watch him, calm but alert. He made himself a mug of coffee, though it was more out of habit than need. His hands trembled slightly as he brought it to his lips. Everything about this felt unreal. A grizzly bear and her two cubs were asleep by his fire. If anyone else had told him this story, he would have laughed in disbelief. But this was real. This was now. He glanced at the trap lying near the door. The rusted steel glinted in the firelight. Caleb picked it up and turned it over slowly. The spring was busted from when he'd wrenched it off the cub's leg. But the real concern wasn't the trap itself. It was the fact that it had been there in the first place. Traps like that hadn't been legal in this region for years. Whoever had set it knew that. And judging by how fresh the wound was on the cub's leg, it had only been a day or two. Someone was out there. Someone who likely wasn't done yet. The storm had started to let up outside. He could hear the change in the wind, the violent shrieks turning into long, mournful sighs. Caleb stood and crossed to the window. The sky beyond was still dark, but snow had stopped falling. The trees, heavy with ice, stood motionless in the dim moonlight. Everything looked untouched, quiet, still. He opened the door a crack and stepped outside. The cold hit him instantly, sharp and biting. His boots sank into the snow, nearly up to his knees. He scanned the tree line, then the edge of the ridge. At first, he saw nothing. Then something caught his eye. Faint impressions in the snow leading away from the cabin. Not animal prints. Footprints. Human. And recent. Caleb's gut clenched. He followed them a few yards before the trail disappeared into the trees, swallowed by shadow. Whoever it was had been watching the cabin. Watching him. Watching the bear. He turned back, heart pounding, and stepped inside, locking the door behind him. The mother bear lifted her head this time, watching him. He didn't speak, didn't move too quickly. She seemed to understand. Or maybe she was simply too tired to care. Caleb reached for his old medical kit, tucked beneath the cabinet. He knelt down beside the wounded cub, now sleeping with its paw still wrapped in the blood-stained blanket. Gently, he pulled the fabric back and examined the leg. The swelling hadn't worsened. That was a relief. But the wound was raw, angry. Infection would come quick in conditions like this. The bear growled softly, not a warning, but a sound of concern. Caleb didn't look at her as he cleaned the wound, speaking low and steady. "I'm not hurting him," he said. "I'm trying to help. You already know that, don't you?" He glanced at her. She blinked slowly, then let her head fall back down beside her cubs. By the time morning arrived, a gray, pale light had seeped into the cabin. The fire had died down again, and Caleb was moving through his routine. He heated water for more coffee, checked the last of his canned goods. He hadn't planned for company, certainly not a family of bears. Supplies would run thin quickly if they stayed much longer. Then he noticed something strange. Near the edge of the porch, half buried under snow, was something metallic. He stepped outside again, careful this time, and dug with his gloved hands. It was a scope. A rifle scope, cracked at the edge. The glass, spider-webbed. Not from the storm, but from being dropped or struck. He stared at it for a long moment. The pieces were starting to form a picture he didn't like. Someone had been close. Closer than he'd realized. Someone had lost part of their weapon while stalking this bear. Caleb returned inside, locking the door with more intention this time. He set the scope on the table, beside the broken trap. The bear lifted her head again, eyes flicking between the objects, then back to him. It was absurd to think she understood, but deep down, Caleb wasn't so sure anymore. He sat across from her. The fire cracked behind him. The silence stretched long. "Someone's after you," he said aloud, his voice rasping in the cold air. "And now they know where you are." The bear didn't respond, but her breathing changed, slower, more alert. The day passed in quiet tension. Caleb didn't leave the cabin again. He tended to the wound, offered the cubs small scraps of stew, and watched the tree line through the windows. The bear never slept deeply, never stopped watching. She was recovering, but she was ready, if she had to be. That evening, just as the sky turned a dull orange behind the mountains, Caleb saw movement beyond the ridge. Not an animal. A man. Moving slow. Deliberate. He disappeared behind the trees as quickly as he came, but it was enough. Caleb stepped back from the window, jaw tight. This wasn't over. The bear hadn't come to his cabin by chance. She had been running. Hunted. Injured. Desperate. And now, someone else knew exactly where she'd stopped. He looked at her again. The firelight glowed across her fur, no longer frozen, now matted and stained. Her cubs stirred slightly, pressing tighter into her side. Caleb reached for the rifle he'd set aside the night before. He cleaned it, loaded it, and placed it gently against the door. Whatever was coming, it wouldn't knock next time. The third night settled over the mountains like a heavy shroud. Outside, the trees stood frozen in place, their branches weighed down by snow and silence. The storm had passed, but something colder lingered in its wake. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, casting soft light across the worn floorboards. Caleb sat at the table, his eyes drifting from the flickering flames to the bear curled near the hearth. She hadn't moved much since the night before. Her breathing had grown more even, the ragged edge of desperation now dulled by rest. Her cubs were stronger, though still frail. They had begun to move around the cabin in cautious little circles, sniffing at the corners, always returning to their mother's side. Caleb had grown used to their presence, strangely so. What once had been unthinkable now felt normal, almost peaceful. But peace, he knew, didn't last in these woods. As dusk turned to full dark, he stood by the window and watched. Beyond the clearing, the forest breathed slowly under the moonlight. And then he saw it. A flicker of movement, a shape, a man, just beyond the line of pines, still, watching. Caleb backed away from the window and reached for his rifle. The scope on the table, cracked and useless, was a warning he hadn't taken lightly. He had spent years tracking poachers in these woods. He knew how they worked, how they waited, how they never came unarmed. He didn't tell the bear. That would have been foolish. But as if she sensed the shift in the air, she stirred, her ears pricking up. Her eyes met his. Alert. A silent understanding passed between them. She was ready. So was he. The knock came not long after. 3 slow raps on the door. Not rushed. Not afraid. Confident. Caleb stood still, rifle at his side. The bear rose to her feet, the movement slow but deliberate. Her bulk blocked the firelight, casting a dark, shifting shadow across the room. The cubs whimpered, unsure whether to hide or follow. The knock came again, louder this time. Caleb stepped toward the door. His hand hovered over the latch, his jaw clenched tight. He opened it just enough to see who stood on the other side. A man. Tall. Late 40s. Frost caked the edges of his hood, his breath sharp and fast in the cold. But his eyes didn't flicker with fear. They were steady, searching the space behind Caleb. And then they landed on her. The bear. She didn't growl, she didn't move, neither did Caleb. "You know what that is behind you, right?" the man asked, voice low, cracked from the cold. Caleb said nothing. He didn't have to. The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You should be dead." Still, Caleb stayed silent. "I tracked her down by the river, lost her when the storm hit. I didn't think she'd get far, not with that cub limping." That was all Caleb needed to hear. This wasn't a coincidence. The trap, the scope, the prints. It was all his doing. "She's not yours to hunt," Caleb said quietly. The man's smile disappeared. "She's wild. And that pelt." He paused, rubbing his gloved hands together. "That pelt could buy me a year off the grid." Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself in the doorway. Behind him, the bear let out a low rumble. Not aggressive, but present. "You need to leave," Caleb said. The man's eyes narrowed. "You serious?" Caleb nodded once. "That thing'll turn on you the second she's strong enough. You know that, right?" "Maybe," Caleb said. "But that's not your problem." For a long moment, neither moved. The cold crept into the cabin, curling around Caleb's ankles like smoke. The fire behind him popped, sending sparks into the air. Then, slowly, the man stepped back. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. "That animal doesn't care about you." Caleb didn't lower the rifle. "Neither do you." The man turned and disappeared into the trees. Caleb didn't close the door until the figure vanished completely from view. Only then did he step back inside. The bear was watching. She had seen everything. He lowered the rifle, breathing hard now that the moment had passed. He set it down gently, careful not to make a sound. The bear didn't growl. She didn't lunge. She just looked at him. And for the first time since she arrived, Caleb saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Trust. He returned to his chair and sat slowly. The cubs huddled near their mother again, trembling less now. The heat of the fire began to push back the chill that had followed him in. Caleb stared at the flames, his hands still tight around the shape of a rifle he no longer held. He had faced down plenty of men in his time, but something about tonight felt heavier, the weight of a choice he hadn't expected to make. He didn't know what came next, but he knew this. He had made his stand. And the bear had seen it. In the quiet, she shifted closer to the fire, her cubs pressed against her side. Caleb let the silence stretch. No words needed, no explanation given. Outside, the wind had returned, but it wasn't the storm's howl. It was softer now, the sound of something passing. And inside the cabin, the impossible balance between man and beast held steady, for one more night. Morning came slow and silver. The frost clung stubbornly to the window panes, and the light that filtered into the cabin was pale and quiet. The storm had long passed, leaving behind a world carved in white. Caleb stood by the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal, though his eyes weren't on the food. They were on the bear, and the space between them. She had watched him all through the night after the man left. Never moving much, never growling. Just watching. There was something different in her now. A stillness that wasn't fear. A shift. Her cubs slept close, safe in the blanket he had laid out. Caleb didn't speak. Words felt too small for what had happened. Too human. He brought the steaming bowl to the table, sat down, and sipped his coffee with hands still tense from the hours before. The rifle remained beside the door, untouched. He wasn't sure what he would have done if the man had come back. He only knew what he had done, and that was enough. The bear stretched then, a slow, heavy movement. Her body still weak, but stronger than before. She tested her paws, shifted her weight. Her eyes found Caleb's again. They stayed like that for a while. Two survivors in a place built for no one. Around midday, the cubs stirred, letting out soft squeaks and sniffing the air. Caleb knelt and offered them bits of dried fish and beans. They approached slowly, eyes darting to their mother, who gave no protest. They ate, hesitant at first, then hungrily. The sound of them chewing in the warm cabin was oddly comforting. Outside, the sun climbed higher. It hadn't shown itself for days. But now it glowed just enough to melt the ice off the porch. Caleb stepped outside, needing air. The cold met him like an old friend. He looked toward the tree line, scanning for movement. Nothing. He walked a slow circle around the cabin. His boots crunched in the snow. His breath hung in the air. In the stillness, he could feel something inside him begin to shift. Something he hadn't let himself feel since the day they told him his daughter wouldn't be coming home. When he returned inside, the bear was standing. Not aggressive, not alarmed, just standing. Tall and still in the middle of his cabin, her cubs tucked beside her legs. Caleb stopped. He didn't move closer. He didn't speak. Then, to his quiet disbelief, she took a step forward. And another. He stood frozen as the great creature approached. She stopped just a few feet from him. Her breath was slow, deep. Her massive head tilted slightly to the side. Caleb didn't flinch, didn't run. He looked right back. She stepped closer. Close enough for him to see the ridges of old scars across her face. Close enough to hear the weight of her breathing. And then, softly, impossibly, she extended her muzzle and pressed it, gently, against his hand. It wasn't long, just a moment. But Caleb felt it in his bones. She turned then, nuzzled one of her cubs, and walked slowly toward the door. She paused there, waiting. Caleb understood. He opened it. The light spilled in, brighter than before, almost golden. The bear stepped out first. The cubs followed close behind, their little paws making tiny prints in the fresh snow. She walked a few yards, then turned. For the longest time, she looked back. That same calm, that same ancient knowing. Then she disappeared into the trees without a sound. Caleb stood there long after they were gone, listening, waiting for the crack of a branch or the snap of underbrush, but there was only wind and silence. He didn't realize he was holding the broken trap in his hand until his fingers ached from clenching it. He dropped it into the snow, the metal landing with a dull thud. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt empty. He went back inside, the warmth greeting him like a friend who wasn't sure they were welcome. The cabin felt bigger now, quieter. The fire had burned low again. He added more wood, but it didn't help. Later that evening, he took out an old box from the bottom of the cabinet. Inside were things he hadn't touched in years. A photograph of his daughter, her handwriting on birthday cards, a pink scarf she used to wear on cold mornings. He held it for a long time. Then he put it by the fire, not to burn, just to be near him again. As night fell once more, Caleb sat alone, the weight of solitude heavier than he remembered. But then he heard it. A rustle outside. Light. Hesitant. He rose and opened the door. At the edge of the tree line, barely visible, stood a small cub, alone, smaller than the others, its fur patchy, eyes wide and unsure. Caleb didn't move. The cub took one step forward, then paused. Caleb stepped back, leaving the door open. No words. No promises. Just space. After a long, silent moment, the cub walked into the cabin. And for the second time in his life, Caleb Warren let the wild inside. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Just leave a simple 0 or 1 in the comments to let me know you made it to the end, or share how it made you feel. And if you want more true, powerful stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe. Because next time, we'll be telling another tale that's just as wild, and maybe even more unbelievable.